In this video, I'm going to demonstrate to you some of the first steps that we're going to take when we're on the harbour side at Port Seton. I've put together here some thumbnail sketches in charcoal, looking at some different views of the harbour and the boats, and looking really for interesting compositions. If we're going to be working a little bit under the influence of Seurat and Caillebotte, I think there are elements in their work that we can learn from, and one of them really is to begin by considering what to include in our compositions and how to make interesting compositions. So I've divided my piece of cartridge paper into four, and for the purposes of this demonstration I'm going to use some old photographs that I have of Port Seton Harbour, and I'm going to try and show you a variety of ways in which you might put together these thumbnail sketches. So I'm beginning with a thin stick of willow charcoal. I quite like this view because it's got all this perspective. I probably knelt down to take the photograph so that I had this particular vantage point, which maybe even exaggerates the perspective a little bit. So I think the first thing to do in these situations where you arrive at a new location and you're looking for ideas for paintings, I think the first thing to do is to wander around just with some drawing materials and try and experience a variety of views, of angles, light, change your arrangement from landscape to portrait, and so on. So I've just worked with lines there. I've put down a few lines, starting really with getting some of that perspective. You'll find, of course, when we're at the harbour that there will be plenty to draw and maybe more than you want. And so this is the value of working with these thumbnail sketches, that actually you can leave things out. I like actually the way the nets all recede into the distance. These boats are often quite complicated with extra bits of mast and equipment. And it may be that when you do these thumbnail sketches, that actually you can already begin the process of deciding what to leave out. You know, with a fishing boat, there may be essential. You can work out what's essential to convey the nature of the vessel without actually getting into complicated bits. So that's working with a thin stick of charcoal. That's one idea. So I've turned my paper around. I've got a different view. I'm going to now work with the portrait format. Still working with willow charcoal, but this time how about one of those charcoal rub-away drawings? So cover the page with the charcoal, smudge it, and then I'm going to work more with the side of a thick piece of charcoal. And I think this might be quite good for this particular view because it's very complicated, and starting with the charcoal, covering the page with charcoal, I think might make it easier for me to leave things out. I'm not going to include the lorry and some of this rigging I really don't understand, so I think I can leave it out. But what I do find interesting, apart from the boat in the water, is just some of these, I suppose it's kind of harbour furniture, really. The steps and I think they might be called capstans, the red posts. So I'm working into the prepared charcoal page with the thick stick of charcoal and putting down some darker shapes. And because I've covered the page with charcoal, I think it doesn't matter that I leave things out, because the page is kind of unified, filled by the charcoal that I put down first. So having put down some of those tonal shapes, let's get the trees as well. I'll now work a little bit with the rubber and subtract. So we just start with a bit of sky. So very often what people experience, when we go to a new location, is they're overwhelmed by just how much is there. And I think that's possibly even more so somewhere like Port Seton, because the tide comes in and the tide goes out. The boats come in and the boats go out. So not only is there a lot to choose from, but it's often quite mobile, changing. And I think starting with some of these thumbnail sketches, working on a small scale and beginning to just identify some subject matter. And as I've said at the beginning, under the influence of Seurat and Caillebotte, we may be hopefully thinking in terms of really interesting, almost poetic compositions that identify certain characteristics of this environment. So I've worked with a thick stick of charcoal, and I've now come to my thin stick, and I'm just beginning to add a little bit more definition. So that would be a second way of working, putting down the charcoal first and drawing into it. So I'll have you do that, explore a little bit, and then I'm going to get you to make a start on a small painting. So I will also send you a link to the video I made for the last week's landscape course, looking a little bit at Monet's approach, and in that I demonstrate starting a small painting. So this is an it's an A6 postcard size canvas board, and this really is continuing the process of looking for some compositions and also really getting a handle on working with oil paint. So we're going to start, I encourage you to do at least one of these based on one of your thumbnail sketches. Working on this small scale so that you're basically required to simplify. We're going to have the 3 days at Port Seton, and I think if we can cover some of the basics of putting together an oil painting and really learning how to manipulate the image so that you are able to draw attention to the things that you want to be noticed, and you're able to manage what I've described, the changing environment, and the editing that comes into that thumbnail sketch that I started with, but also then using colour and the handling of the paint in order to really emphasize the things that interest you in this subject. So, as I did in the other video that I referred to, I've started first by tinting the canvas. I've now sketched out with some burnt umber the main shapes that are in my drawing, and then I'm going to mix some colours. And unlike the video that I referred to, with this one I'm going to apply the paint not with a brush. I'm using a brush now, but I'm not going to use a brush to apply colour. I'm going to use pieces of card. So I've mixed some colours for the sky on my palette. I've got a slightly darker and a lighter grey because it wasn't a very sunny day, and I have a piece of mounting card, and I'm going to use that to pick up the paint and apply it to the surface. And the value of this, of course, is that it will oblige me to simplify. And because of the scale of the painting and this fairly, well, I don't want to say clumsy, but simple way of applying the paint, I will get a lot more paint on. There will be some mixing along the way, and also I think I'm going to get a strong version of my composition. So as I've said, coming to a place like Port Seton, it can be kind of overwhelming. What do you do with all this changing scene? And I'm trying to give you some ways of firstly getting a handle on dealing with oil paint and working outdoors, but also a way of selecting some interesting compositions and following through from your thumbnail into something that is as strong and decisive perhaps as the thumbnail. So I've also made something for the quayside. So hopefully you notice that what I begin with really are these large shapes, these big areas, the sky, the quayside, it might have been the water with a different sort of composition, but the smaller, sort of more detailed, possibly more interesting parts of the composition, they come next. I need to get in these big areas first, and as I've demonstrated, I need to be finding a colour, or maybe as I did in the case of the sky, a sort of lighter or darker version of those colours. I need to be simplifying what's in front of me, not just editing things out, leaving them out, but also simplifying the colour that I'm seeing into essential colours. Sometimes looking with your eyes half closed helps with that, to help eliminate the variety. So now, using smaller bits of card, I'm going to begin to deal with the smaller elements of the painting. The fishing boat, for example. And of course it is fiddly and tricky, but I guarantee you, if you can start to work with this approach, you'll get something done very quickly, and you will really learn to see shapes. You'll begin to see all this complicated stuff, boats and rigging and changing harbour, tide coming in and tide coming out. You'll see it all, I suppose, almost through the lens of a piece of card, and that really helps you to simplify. And then, having applied these quite significant quantities of paint using the card on this small scale, I think when you then come to start working with a brush, and possibly on a bigger scale, you're going to have a much stronger sense of composition, but also of how to handle the paint, how to pick it up with a brush in the way that you would with a piece of card, and rather than spread it around until it almost disappears, you'll be much more conscious of placing marks in a more effective way, really. Although you think this isn't an implement designed for drawing, you will actually draw with paint because of the way in which you consider how you best represent your subject by imprinting the paint on the surface. So I've got most things blocked in now, and because of the scale, it's a fiddly scale, but it's also a scale on which things can be altered quite quickly and quite easily. So now that I've put most things in, if there are adjustments that I'd like to make in order to draw more attention, or draw attention to certain parts of the composition, I wanted to get this bit of rope in, which is around the bollard and going off to the boat. So yes, so if there are adjustments that I can see need to be made, for example, I mean this was done from a photograph on a fairly dull day, so I've not got quite as much light and shade as I would quite like. There aren't really any shadows to speak of. And there's not much light in the sky. And I think if I was to change one thing in this painting, I would try and get a little bit more light in the sky, maybe find some shadows around these objects. But that's something that I can handle quite easily on this scale. And if any of the colours were too strong, maybe the red's not strong enough, again, I can make those adjustments quite quickly. So that's what I want to demonstrate as our first stages then. We're going to do some thumbnail sketches in charcoal, explore the harbour on a small scale, and then set about making some of these postcard-sized paintings. And I think you'll find that you'll really take in all the possibilities quite quickly, and then there will be the rest of the first day and the second and third days to explore some of the ideas that come up first. Okay, so let's hope the sun shines.